what better way to cap off a Great Depression than with a global conflagration? Before we get started, though, on World War II, we need to go back to the end of World War I. And I want to take a look at, revisit how that played out, and then spend some time talking about, even though this is U.S. history, spend some time talking about what was going on in Germany and Japan in the 1920s and 30s, so as to provide context to better understand what the situation is when the United States does get involved. As you recall, when World War I started, the Central Powers consisted of the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the German Empire. That's a lot of empires. The German Empire, of course, was led by an emperor, Wilhelm, who was actually the grandson of Queen Victoria, called Kaiser Wilhelm, Kaiser being German for Caesar, hence for emperor. That empire was referred to as the Second Reich, which means empire. It had been formed. Well, let's go back to the First Reich briefly. We're talking there about the Holy Roman Empire, not the Roman Empire with the Caesars and all, but the Holy Roman Empire that was that came into being around the 9th century. Charlemagne and all that, and was a major power for about 1,000 years in Europe, but which dissolved during the Napoleonic Wars in 1806, and was broken up into smaller groups, one of which was the Kingdom of Germany. Then several German-speaking city-states came together after that, 1815, and formed the German Confederation, and then they were reunified in 1871 into the modern nation of Germany. So First Reich, Charlemagne; Second Reich, the Kaisers. As World War I was drawing to a close, the Austrians had already surrendered in late 1918. There was quite a bit of unrest in Germany. A lot of people were tired of the war and angry at their government for its participation in the war. So even as the war is winding down and things are looking really bad for the German army, there was a mini revolution going on. There were mutinies popping up all over the place in the German army and navy, and the social unrest was largely led by people on the left. And actually, before the fighting had stopped, this revolution kind of was the handwriting on the wall, and Kaiser Wilhelm stepped down. He abdicated and ran off to, I think, the Netherlands, where he lived out the rest of his life for about another 20 years or so. So the German Empire crumbled. After the collapse of the empire, a constitutional assembly was called to form a new government, and this assembly met in the city of Weimar in central Germany. And when all was said and done, they had come up with a replacement government, and it was a completely different kind of government, no longer a monarchy. Rather, it was going to be a liberal republic, a parliamentarian republic. The capital would still be in Berlin. This republic is sometimes referred to by historians as the Weimar Republic, and this is the government that was in charge during the Treaty of Versailles and into and through the 1920s, which, when talking about Germany, is called the Weimar period. Now, people in 1919 weren't necessarily calling themselves citizens of the Weimar Republic, but rather the Republic of Germany. So this is the flag that they decided on, a flag that had been used before by one of the German city-states. And if it looks at all familiar to you, that's because it is the flag of Germany today, although As you're aware, there was a change in flags in the 1930s, but we'll be getting to that. We talked about the Treaty of Versailles already when we reached the end of our discussion about World War I. But let's revisit it briefly in a different context from the perspective of Germany. So, among the many articles that came about in this treaty, several things were imposed on Germany by the Allies. Germany was ordered to be mostly demilitarized, which translated into they were no longer allowed to have submarines. They were no longer allowed to have naval aircraft. They were only allowed to have a handful of ships, like 6 battleships total. Their army could not be larger than 100,000. And for context there, during the war, World War I, it had been something like 4.5 million. So that's a significant reduction. Also, the war guilt clause. Essentially, by signing this treaty, Germany had to admit that the whole war was their fault and accept moral responsibility for it. That was insisted upon by several of Germany's neighboring Allied countries. Also, it was forbidden for Germany and Austria to ever again have an alliance or to be united, particularly under one government. The Rhineland, which is in western Germany along the border of France and part of the border with Belgium, was to be occupied by the Allies, and as it turned out, that was mostly French soldiers. The Rhineland was an industrial center. There were a lot of coal mines, so it was very important. And Germany was required to make massive reparation payments. Essentially, they were ordered to pay for the whole war. And it took them a while. The final payment was made in October of 2010, although to be fair, there for about a decade when Hitler was in charge, they weren't paying their bills. But still, that gives you an idea of just how long-lasting this was. That's almost a century it took them to pay off that particular debt. Now, imagine how the German people felt having lost the war. That's kind of a blow already. And then having all these sanctions put on them. Their military severely hampered, barely even having a military at all. And when you consider the militaristic, nationalistic pride of an empire and its citizens, to have that completely taken away overnight caused some frustration. The reparations not only caused frustration and embarrassment, but economic hardship, as things were pretty bad for a while there in Germany financially. Money was quickly devalued. And the war guilt clause. The war guilt clause, out of all of these, you might think that would have had the least effect because all these other things have physical, tangible things attached to them. But the war guilt clause may have been, it certainly was one of, the biggest frustrations for the German people, who felt it was very unfair for the whole thing to be blamed on them, when in reality it had been kind of a spiraling chain of events. So, as we talked about before, this is kind of setting the stage for a lot of anger and frustration and economic hardship that is going to open the way for a demagogue, a populist leader to come along and take advantage of that, which, as you probably know, happens. By the way, part of the Rhineland being occupied, that lasted for several years. The French did finally withdraw, but the German army was forbidden to enter the Rhineland, period. So, if you look at most of these clauses, the ones that had tangible physical aspects to them, the demilitarization, union with Austria, no German troops in. All those things, as we'll be talking about later, but if you know your World War II history, you're already aware, all those things happened anyway in the 1930s. And they stopped paying their bills and they stopped admitting to any guilt in World War I. In addition to all of that, Germany lost territory. They lost all their colonies in Africa and Asia and elsewhere. I mentioned their naval restrictions. They also lost their large merchant ships. But even beyond that, they lost parts of Germany itself. As you can see in the map here, the lower left-hand corner, you can see that big area of the Rhineland that France occupied, but Denmark got a little piece. The newly formed country of Czechoslovakia got a little piece. The newly reconstituted country of Poland got a big piece. So there were just little pieces being sort of carved away, and that added to the bitterness of the German people. Well, the new Weimar government was, it had coalesced and come into being at a particularly challenging time, and immediately found itself being challenged from both ends of the political spectrum. People on the left were frustrated and disappointed and upset that the Weimar government wasn't left enough. They wanted many people to go all the way to the left, to have a Marxist state. There were many labor actions and strikes that came about as a result of the left's opposition to the Weimar's kind of more left of center approach. And meanwhile, people on the far right were extremely upset because they thought it was too far to the left and they wanted to come back to the right. They wanted to have to go back to having a strong central government. And they blamed the liberal Weimar government for accepting that Treaty of Versailles. Now, remember, the Weimar government was formed basically just in time to be in charge at this treaty meeting. So a lot of people on the far right viewed the Weimar government as not only weak, but in some cases treacherously weak, dangerously to the country. So they've got pressure coming at them from both ends. One of the far right groups that opposed the policies of the Weimar government, and in fact the very existence of the Weimar government, was a group known as the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei. So Nazi, that's where the term Nazi comes from. If they had been established in an English-speaking country, we would probably be talking about Nashies for nationalist. Anyway, the NSDAP, or more familiarly, the Nazis. Founded in 1920. Actually, they were sort of a reformation of a short-lived group called just the German Workers' Party that was established in early 1919, only lasted a few months. Then they reconstituted, added the National Socialist part. Young guy named Adolf Hitler was a member. He had joined early on when they were just the German Workers' Party. Hitler was from Austria, and when he was about 24 years old, right before a year before World War I broke out, he had moved to Munich and was living in Munich when the war started. And as a citizen of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, he was subject to the draft, and he was drafted by the Austrian army. And when he reported for duty, he wasn't accepted. He was deemed unfit for service physically. So he went back to Munich and joined the German army. there who took him. And over the course of the war, he rose to the rank of corporal. And then when the war was over, he joined this far right group, quickly rising in its ranks to become the leader of the group by 1921. And he started structuring the group to resemble, both in appearance, and by appearance I mean in way of dress, in the uniforms that they had, and also in philosophy. He was trying to emulate the fascists of Italy under Benito Mussolini, whom we'll be talking about a little bit later. Well, 1923, Hitler engineered, if engineer is a word for it, what came to be known as the Beer Hall Putsch, essentially a big fight. It was essentially an effort at a coup, an effort to overthrow the army. Hitler was one of those. He was foremost among those who claimed that the German army had been stabbed in the back by the government at the end of World War I. That November Revolution, he referred to the Weimar government now as the November criminals. In fact, the conspiracy theory, or the point of view, the perspective that Hitler and a lot of other people in Germany had, was that, in fact, the German army was winning World War I, and they would have gone ahead and won it if not for all those dadgum socialists and communists and revolutionaries who disrupted everything and then attacked the German army from the rear, causing them to not be able to continue fighting. So he blamed the Weimar establishment for essentially, stabbing the army and Germany, the German Empire, in the back. So his plan was, and he had several followers. He showed up at this beer hall in Munich where speeches were being given. Showed up with his fascist Nazis and declared that the revolution was on. He was waving a pistol around, and the plan was to seize the seat of government there in Munich and take over that state, and then from there go on and take over all of Germany. He believed that the ultra-conservative people who were in the police force and in the state police and what little military there was would rally to his cause, but they didn't. And he and his crew were pretty quickly subdued and arrested, and Hitler was sent to prison for a while, which is where he wrote his memoir, his autobiography up to that point, Mein Kampf. I've tried to read it, but it's a struggle, in which he essentially laid out everything he'd like to do if he were in charge. So that book was in print, and then when he did wind up in charge, people all around the world were like, I can't believe he did this stuff. But, there it all was.